keep you updated on this. I asked some of you to move to the 9 last week, and so not you, obviously, you didn't move, but other people did. I'm just playing. But we're out of space at the 9 now, so stay put where you're at, and I'll keep updating you on that. So thank you to all those who were able to do that. Glad you're with us today. Last weekend was our first Reimagined Vision Night. Some of you know about it. And it was absolutely incredible at 5 o'clock. And if you are a group leader, a group participant in community groups here, you're a volunteer, you volunteer to be a bridge builder. You've gotten multiple emails, as I said last week, and text messages, and you're going to get more this week. Don't apologize for it. On the 25th is your last opportunity. This is an historic next step in the life of our church. It's a big deal. I'm so excited about it, and I seriously don't want you to miss it. And you're the heart of our church if you volunteer, if you're in a group. So go find that stuff. As I said, it may be in your spam folder on the 25th, 5 o'clock. It's an hour and a half long. Childcare is provided. We need every volunteer and group member here that night. And then the rest of you who are like, what are you talking about? As I said, your chance to hear about it is when? That was depressing. September the 15th is rearrange your vacation plans. I don't say this often. Be here as a CCer. You can't miss it. In fact, for 3 weeks in a row on the 22nd, 29th, but starting on the 15th, we need everybody here for our brand new Reimagine series. It's just a big, big deal in the life of our church. And so I hope you will make plans to make it a priority. As I said last week, for some of you, it's going to be historic that you attend church 3 weeks in a row. And so that will be amazing. So do not miss starting on September the 15th. So what's the date? Okay, September 15th. All right. So with that said, we are in part 2 of a brand new series called What Our World Needs Now. And our kind of country specifically is so obsessed with who our world needs now. And for a lot of people, what our world needs is, a political candidate or some kind of social issue that needs to be changed. And so I just determined when we started this church that I would talk about things that intersected with culture and theology, specifically around Jesus followers and how we should behave and live and act. So that's what I'm doing in this series because, nobody is caught by surprise that we're in kind of another round of crazy nationally and in regard to our world. So rather than who our world needs now, we said last week, a better obsession for us is what our world needs now. And I'm not going to open it up for discussion because everybody has a different answer, right? Everybody has a different opinion. And what we said last week is that what our world needs now more than anything, if you're a follower of Jesus, is mature Jesus followers. And if you're not a Jesus follower, I say this every week, you don't have to do anything that I say. You can just tune out. You can point your finger, call us hypocrites. I don't care. You didn't sign on to the Jesus thing, so you can just kind of listen. But if you're a Jesus follower, we have been called to be, for some of you, this is kind of old school word, Christ-like. That Jesus followers would follow Jesus into maturity. Specifically around an area I want to look at today, it's something that Paul and Jesus both taught throughout the New Testament, and it really should influence and dictate how we engage and respond to culture and the world around us. But here's the thing. There has been kind of a movement around a version of Christianity that has distorted some of these teachings from Jesus and from Paul. And the church, specifically nationally in America, has in some ways lost its way and lost sight of some of what Paul and Jesus taught in regard to how we engage culture, especially cultural chaos. And this isn't kind of a new version of Christianity, but there's been several iterations. It kind of came onto the scene, more popularly in the 70s. But here's how I would describe it. It's what you could call culture war Christianity. And there's a lot of definitions, but here's my definition of culture war Christianity. It is implement our values, our way and our strategy, sometimes at all costs. In some cases, the means justify the end because it's like, well, there's a lot at stake. And so we'll kind of justify what we get to in an approach to win and to implement our way, our values, our agenda. Now, let me back up to kind of talk about this and describe it before I dive in. Here's the thing that's true about every human being, regardless of where you live or what your view of the world is. When life is going well, both personally for you or just in terms of the world, like you feel like things are going pretty well, you lose sight, this is just human nature, of what you value the most and what you fear the most. You just do. It's not front of mind. Things are, cruising. You're good. But as soon as things get chaotic, the world around you gets chaotic, your life gets chaotic, all of a sudden, your reactions tell a story about you. Your reactions start to reveal something about you. It's why uncertainty doesn't actually alter our value system. Uncertainty or chaos just reveals our value system. And our reactions to uncertainty or sense of loss or things just feel out of control or things are a mess with my family, all of a sudden it just reveals, your reactions reveal something about you. It's why our actions don't actually tell the whole story. Like, they're louder than words, but actions don't tell the whole story. Our reactions tell the whole story. How we react when we're under pressure, how we react when there's chaos, how we react when we feel out of control. So here's why I want to talk about this. So many Christians in our nation right now, in response to whether it's political chaos or economic chaos or social chaos, have begun to respond and react in ways that it's kind of been hidden behind their Bible-laced themes all along of what they actually care about, of a hidden agenda that they're actually committed to. And it's an agenda for many in our nation and among many churches that people outside of faith or outside of Christianity have kind of suspected all along. And what they've suspected is this among the viewpoint of many Jesus followers in the church, and that is that the church is committed to and is concerned about what every other ideological group is concerned about. And that's this right here, winning. Winning. And they've suspected that Christians kind of have the same fear that every other ideological group has a fear of, and that is losing. Losing our voice, losing our influence, losing, our rights. But here's what is so unbelievably interesting about this. If you study history and you study church history from the very beginning, ironically, that is the exact thing that happens. The moment we lose sight of our God-ordained mandate, and we start to stoop to the kingdoms of this world ways of winning. We lose our influence. We lose our voice. We lose our mandate with what God has called us to do in our communities and in our neighborhoods and ultimately in our nation. And we're gonna look at this in a second, but here's the reality. We've been called more than anything else to win people, to win hearts, to quote Paul, not to win culture wars. And we certainly haven't been called as the church, I'll talk to us specifically in a few minutes, but the church, to win elections. And what is crazy to me right now, if you'll just go with me on this journey, don't check out until the end, is that there are churches in our nation, and specifically religious leaders and pastors, who by their un-Christ-like rhetoric and by their fear-based posturing have alienated half of the people in our country and half of the people in our communities and in our neighborhoods. Because that's what culture war Christianity does. That's what this version of Christianity does. It sees itself as perpetually under attack, so it's got to attack back, and don't miss this, it always needs an enemy for sustainability. Some of you grew up in a church like that where there was always an enemy. There was always some kind of threat. There was always something that you have to watch out for. And so you have specifically, let me just rail on the pastors for a second because I am one, so I can talk about us, that use this kind of un-Christ-like rhetoric and fear-based posturing. And they alienate a whole group of people in their communities, in their neighborhoods. And you know what they've done? They've turned the mission field into a battlefield. And they would never admit this. But what they have in common is who they hate. And in many cases, and this is so absurd to me, people that vote differently than them or see the world different than they see the world. And here's the thing that I always think, and I don't know if any of you are there with me, but I always think, okay, even if that were true, even if the people are your enemy that vote differently than you and they think differently, even if they were actually your enemy, do you remember Jesus' words? See if you guys can finish them for me. I think he said, love your, we do know it, love your enemy. Pray for those who do what? So I always think, okay, so even if that's true and they are your enemy, haven't you been called to love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you? And if you think they're off the rails and need Jesus, then isn't it your goal to win them to the life and the freedom found in Jesus? I don't think you do that by alienating them, by demonizing them, by unnecessarily criticizing them, but that's exactly what culture war Christianity does. It puts the church, I'm talking about the kind of the church as a whole, in a defensive posture, where sometimes it loses sight of its mandate and its mission, and it starts to be more concerned with winning than it is with loving. And behind all of it is this fear of losing something. In fact, I'll see this all the time where it's like Christians, and this is a little kind of a bumper sticker statement from Christians, they're like, faith over fear, faith over fear. And then the next statement, they're like, and do you know all the things we need to be terrified about? Do you know all the things that you should be concerned about? You know what is at stake? Do you know how terrified you should be about everything that's happening in the world? And here's the reality. That version of Christianity, I call it a version because it does not represent the first century version of what Jesus introduced. And I think in our cultural moment, and you guys as a church, I think have been spectacular at this. But it just, in a larger scale, this cultural moment, I think the church as a whole, which is why we're talking about this, has missed an unbelievable opportunity to live and to react in a way that is counter to all the rest of the culture, to actually be distinct. But instead, in a lot of cases, we have done exactly what Paul warned us not to do. And here's what Paul warned us not to do in Philippians 2:14. You guys still with me? Do everything without what? Okay, I felt you were on point with even how you said that, because you sounded like you were grumbling and arguing even as you uttered those words. He's like, stop grumbling and arguing and complaining. And here's the implication. There is stuff to grumble and complain and argue about. You don't have to look very far. But why shouldn't we? And then Paul basically quotes, kind of says in a different way what we looked at last week that Jesus said in his most famous sermon, the Sermon on the Mount, purpose statement, verse 15. You shouldn't do this so that you may become blameless and pure, not perfect, but literally that you would become a mature follower of Jesus, that you would be Christ-like, that you would actually start to look like Christ and look like Jesus. And then he says this, that you would be children of God without finding fault in a warped and crooked generation. And Paul's like, have you ever found yourself going, man, the world is so jacked up. Like everything is a mess, it's so jacked up. Paul's like, get in line. Every generation is gonna say the same thing because it's true. There's parts about your culture and your world, it's just a mess. It's not how God designed it, it's jacked up. And he's going, I'll give you that. But then Paul basically would say this, if you complain and you argue like everybody else, guess what? You end up looking like everybody else. And you're a Jesus follower. You haven't been called to look like everybody else. And then basically Paul turns it around and goes, okay, but if you would actually follow Jesus into this, if you would actually begin to grow into maturity and Christ-likeness, here's what happens when we get this right. Not perfect, but we begin to get this right. He says, then you will do what? You will. It's the bold word right there. I'll give you one more opportunity. And you will what? Shine like stars in the sky. He's like, the contrast will be that where the Jesus followers are at, there is a difference. There's a difference because of how they live, how they respond, how they react. What should be said of us in any community is, I don't agree with those guys on everything. Some of the stuff they believe is crazy. I don't understand why they take so much time on their Sunday morning when you could be out on a boat somewhere. I don't know why they do that with their life, and they're generous, but I want to hire one. I want my daughter to marry one. I want to work for one. I mean, if you can find a Jesus follower in any community, you should link up with them because those people, the way they live is extraordinary. And Paul's like, that's what should be said of us in any community, in any culture, any generation, that there is something about the Jesus followers that stops people in their tracks because of the way they live. And yet, how honest can we be today? In our current cultural moment, so much of the Jesus movement, the church, is characterized by Jesus followers arguing with one another and complaining and arguing with neighbors. And it's as if we forget that we serve a king that has superseded every other king. And then Jesus puts it this way, and he says this in these really famous words. To use these words, he says, we have an opportunity to let our light do what? To let our light shine before others, that they may, help me out one more time, they may what? See our good deeds and glorify our Father in heaven. And here, let me just kind of talk, how safe is this room? We won't let it leave the airways of radio, or keep this between us. One of the things that you see over and over again is Christians demonizing and criticizing on social media people by name that they've never met before. And sometimes I have to use social media for my job. I don't do a ton of scrolling, but when I do, I hold my breath. Because when I bump into people that I know are Christians or Jesus followers, and I see them specifically around politics or other social issues, and there's these memes and different things, reels that they'll share, and just attacking and demonizing, mocking other people and politicians and whole groups. And I think, are you kidding? I don't think that characterizes what Paul and Jesus invited us into. And then if I can be real honest, sometimes I'll scroll and I hope you don't go to our church. And if you do, I hope you haven't shared any of our posts because I don't want anybody to know you go here, right? But here's the thing. When that happens, we lose our moral authority in terms of what, not superiority, but what God has called us into, knowing whom we follow and who we serve. And what begins to happen, especially with the next generation, they start to wonder, I wonder if you actually believe what you claim to believe. But isn't it true? And again, I'm just talking to the Jesus followers. Nobody else, you don't have to listen to me. But the Jesus followers, isn't it true? They kind of criticizing and demonizing people who have a different political ideology or vote different has kind of become an exercise in virtue, even within the church. Thank you. In the church and among Jesus followers. And so I just want to say this as clear as I can to those who have decided I'm following Jesus. The many pastors who listen to us via Unfiltered Radio, if I can be so bold as to say, if you're a Jesus follower, if you're a pastor, you have no business engaging in that. We've been called to shine, to be light, to live differently. And we always defend it. We're like, well, there's so much at stake. And okay, I get all that. And then we'll go like, well, we're not going to be intimidated. The church isn't going to be, Jesus followers aren't going to be intimidated. We need to fight the good fight. Misinterpreted. Fight the good fight. We need to stand for truth. We need to stand for religious rights. We are in it to win it. Which I get. I understand that. I completely understand that. And that sounds great. Until you follow Jesus through the Gospels. And that sounds great until you follow Paul from Greece to Jerusalem to Rome. And is weak and passive, and I get it. I understand all your objections. Un-American as this sounds, here's the reality. The church is not here to win. The church is not here to win. By all, before you discount me, by all human accounts, by all human measures, your Savior came to lose on purpose, with a purpose. I mean, he couldn't have been more clear with his disciples. They're on the way to Jerusalem. Jesus knows exactly what he's going to do. He's got, guys, just so you're aware, because I feel like you're missing it. I've got to go and I'm going to be arrested and I'm going to be crucified. And they're like, Jesus, you're the promised Messiah. You're the king. And they thought he was going to set up a political kingdom. You're going to overthrow Rome. You're going to take your seat on your throne. You are the king of all kings, God's final king. If you go and are arrested and crucified, how are we going to win? And Jesus turns to his guys and says, that's how we're going to win. And then they watched the best possible person in all of human history die the worst possible death so that he could amplify to the generations. Even the king that will be God's final king, the Son of Man, did not come to be served, but to serve and to lose, to give his life a ransom for the world so that the world could win. And now you are his body. You are his followers. You've been called to be Christ-like and to follow him into maturity. And when we allow our faith to be subjugated to the political party of our choice, and I'll talk about it in a second, you should be engaged. I'm not talking about you as an individual person. I'm talking about the church. When we allow it to be subjugated, guess what happens? We lose our influence. And we lose our voice. And we lose ultimately our way and our distinction. And just listen to me for a second, because this is such a danger. I think this is happening so much nationally right now. It sets the church up to become a tool of politicians rather than the conscience of a community and the conscience of a neighborhood and the conscience of a nation. And from the very beginning, Jesus birthed an others first movement that would become a conscience for the entire world. And in some cases, we can just become a pawn. And again, I'll talk about in a second, you should be engaged, but just be aware of the fact that eventually, rather than filtering everything in regard to your engagement through the lens of Jesus, we can start filtering it through our lens of winning whatever we think we need to win. And without realizing it, sometimes you can recreate Jesus to stay in alignment with your world or political view, even when it strays and is far from what Jesus actually intended. And so Jesus says, Paul says, I want you to think differently. Jesus did not come to win the way we define win. Jesus actually came to lose, and then he redefined a completely different win for us. I mean, Paul knew this. Paul planted a church in Antioch, and Antioch was the first place where the term Christian shows up because they called those in Antioch Christians as a derogatory term from the outside. And you have to imagine people in that culture, to the people in Antioch, are like, hey, you know how bad things are? You guys probably should grab a picket sign and go down to Nero's circus and start speaking against everything that's happened. Do you know what Rome is doing? Do you know what influences are against us? Do you know the fact that we are marginalized and we have lost everything? And yet Antioch just continued to live differently. And so outsiders literally, as a derogatory term, are like, you guys are like little Christs. You're like little Jesuses that run around. And they're like, yeah, we are. Because they lived so distinct from the culture around them. And Paul knew, and he saw it, that this kind of thinking, this kind of way, the way that Jesus modeled, it changed the world. It changes neighborhoods. It changes families. It changes communities. I mean, if we were to be honest, many of you are listening and many on radio would say that it transformed and it changed ultimately your life. And here's what I'm not saying, to be clear, because the problem is when I do a series like this, people can read into it 1,000 different ways, and that's fine. But to be clear, I'm not saying that you should disengage from political engagement, cultural engagement, the opposite. As Christians, we've been called to love and care. We've been called to try to create the flourishing of all people as much as we possibly can, because they're made in the imago Dei, regardless of where they come from or what their life or background is like. But everybody is going to disagree about how we do that in terms of culture. But you should be engaged. In fact, not that long ago, I met with a guy who attends our church that he is or was the kind of the right-hand person for one of our congressmen, and had a ton of influence with policy and just was doing incredible work. And so he wanted to meet, and so we met, we did coffee, and he just talked about, not all the other stuff, policy, that's not my thing, but he basically asked the question, how can I engage in this arena that God has called me to and be light and shine and be what God has called me to be as a Christ-like influence? Because we should be engaged. But here's what I'm saying before you think I'm talking out two sides of my mouth. Our posture, in our tone, in our approach, in terms of how we engage should look like Jesus. And Jesus and Paul could not have been more clear. He already set the standard for our tone, our posture, and our approach. And now he's like, hey, 2024 Christians, you don't get to make it up. You don't get to change the rules. You don't need to go, so much is at stake. Paul's like, are you kidding me? I was a Christian in Nero under Rome. It's not that bad for you. You're going to be fine. He's like, you don't get to reset the rules. The posture and the tone and the approach has already been set by King Jesus. That's what you're to follow. That's what you're to model in your engagement. And then Paul comes along to the Corinthian church, and then he gives basically his different kind of win or strategy for winning that he saw modeled by Jesus. And again, I just want to say what many of us think. You're like, dude, it's so weak. I mean, what Paul's about to say, it's so naive. Nobody gets anything done. There's no way this is going to work. And I remind you this all the time, but I just want to say it one more time, FYI. Jesus and Paul changed Western civilization with their lame ideas. I love you. I'm sure you're killing it at work. I doubt you're going to change Western civilization. And here's what Paul says. Though I'm free, in 1 Corinthians 9:19, free and I belong to no one. I have made myself what? A slave to everyone. And we read slave figuratively. It wasn't for Paul. Their whole economy was based on slavery. In the first century, it wasn't based on race. Instead, it was based on debt and property. And so when you got into debt, this would be a problem for a lot of us, you could be subject to slavery. And so Paul says, I understand this kind of culture, and I have willingly engaged to figuratively make myself a slave. And you're like, Paul, what's wrong with you? Make yourself a slave, put yourself second to people who disagree with you. And Paul's like, exactly. I have given up so much. I have willfully put myself second. I have willfully engaged in people who are nothing like me in order to do what God has called me to do. And so he says, though I am free and I belong to no one, I've made myself a slave to everyone. And then Paul reveals his agenda, our agenda, given to him by his king. He said, the reason that I do this is to what? It's one more time. The reason I do this is to what? Win as many as possible. And his goal, just imagine this. This is people that had embraced a polytheistic view of God. They had no concept for what Jesus brought to planet Earth. They couldn't even wrap their minds around it. And I mean, think about how tough Paul's job was. He was leading these people from a multi-generational worldview and view about God into a brand new worldview where they would see and respond to everything differently. And people responded the same way to Paul. Like, Paul, are you serious? It's so lame. It's so weak. It's never going to work. You're telling me you're going to submit to and serve people as a way of influencing people? That does not work in any culture. And Paul continues, to the Jews, I became like a Jew to win the Jews. And that's confusing to us because Paul was a Jew, but not in first century categorization, because they kind of had categories for Jews. He was a Hebrew from Tarsus, so to just kind of point blank, basically what he's saying is, I had to become like the Judeans, which means I gave up a lot. I put myself second. In fact, I adopted a whole different way of thinking, and I engaged with their culture in order to be able to be on mission with Jesus. And then he says this, and to those under the law, I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, talking about the Old Testament, so as to win those under the law. And to those not having the law, I became like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law. And then this is where it intersects with us. I am under Christ's law. I'm under, Paul would say, the law of a new king, God's final king, who's come to usher in a brand new kingdom. And Christ's law, the 613 some odd Old Testament commands, were all summarized by Jesus into a single command. I want you to love other people the way that I have loved you in Christ. That's your mandate. So our posture, by Christ's law, our posture, our tone, our approach has already been set. That we are to love other people regardless of their political view. And then he says, so as to what? One more run at it. Like you mean it. So as to what? Win those not having the law. And again, I think if we reinterpret this in 2024 language and some of the current climate of the church, it'd be like, Paul, take a stand, man. Stop playing the fence. Stop being in the middle. Take a stand and stand up. And I'll just tell you, if I can, again, just be real honest with this message, a lot of pastors in our current climate, if they don't politicize their church on one side or the other, they get accused of, you're not taking a stand. You need to take a stand. Now, the interpretation is always, make sure you take a stand on my side of whatever I'm standing for. But take a stand. And I've had that. I've been accused of that. In fact, several years ago, it's safe for me to say this, I got a message or an email from somebody that at the time attended our church, and they were so mad, and I get it. Because they were like, I don't know what side you're on. And so they went through this whole thing, and like 1 week I think you're on, when they were talking about politically, 1 week I think you're on one side, other week I think you're on the other side. I can't figure out what side you're on. And I just emailed back and I was like, thank you, exclamation point. And I wasn't trying to be a jerk. I don't know if that was the right response or not, but I was like, that's exactly the point. That's not what the church of Jesus has been called to do. So I just want to be real clear as our world and nation and churches head into another round of crazy. I am taking a stand. We are taking a stand. We're taking a stand against politicizing the ecclesia of Jesus. We're taking a stand against, that's the Greek word for the church of Jesus, the movement of Jesus. We're taking a stand for the tone and the posture and the approach of what Jesus has laid out for every single church and every single Jesus follower mandated by our King. We're taking a stand from alienating half of our community, half of our neighborhoods, half of our world, and instead we are taking a stand against the divisive political rhetoric and standing with Jesus in the messy middle, because here's where our stand is. We believe the stand of the church that represent Jesus is that we can disagree culturally and we can disagree politically and we can still love unconditionally, because that's the mandate of Christ's law. It's why I've said this throughout this series, that we're to adopt the posture of Jesus that says, I want you to follow me into maturity. And then Paul writes what is one of my favorite statements in all the New Testament. And this, he kind of defines once and for all his mission and strategy. And he says this, I have become what? All things to all people. I become all things to all people. I have gone out of my way to learn how to build relationships with people that I have virtually nothing in common with. Because Jesus followers listen. And Jesus followers learn from people who have not experienced the world the way they've experienced the world. And Jesus followers love, not so they can change their thinking and their beliefs. That's not the point. So that they can grow in empathy. And they can grow in love, and they can grow in terms of our ultimate mission on planet Earth. And so Paul says, I become all things to all people. Why? So that by all possible means, meaning even if it includes being misunderstood and mistreated, Paul's like, I'm all in. Why? Because my mission is that I might save some. And I won't let anything get in the way of that mission, Paul would say. Because what's most important is that people find forgiveness and hope and life and freedom in a Savior. And that's the only thing that is gonna matter for any human being for all of eternity. And Paul says, that's my chief aim. Are there problems in Rome? 100%. Am I a big fan of Nero? No. Do I love what's happening here? No. But I have a bigger calling and a bigger aim. And yeah, I'm gonna engage, but I'm gonna make sure that my primary filter is to save people who need grace and forgiveness that is only found in my Savior, Jesus. It's crazy because this may not be astounding to you. It's astounding that anything that Paul wrote survived. It is astounding. And the only reason it survived is because Paul was willing to stand and not bend against the prevailing cultural worldview of his time. And he actually believed that Yahweh, this one God who condescended into human flesh, that Yahweh had done something for the world in spite of what was happening in the world. And it's why Paul was unwilling to give up, again, not superiority or arrogance. Paul was unwilling to give up his moral authority, his ethical high ground, because he believed he had no compulsion to win anything. Look at the life of Paul. And you know why? Because Paul believed that God had already won, which means the world had already won. And they just needed somebody to tell them. And so Paul made it his mission. I'm gonna tell them, and I'm not gonna let anything get in the way of that message. It's why I've said it throughout this series as we've started it so far. Never, ever burn a relational bridge over a political view. Never burn a relational bridge over a political view. You know why? Because there are some things more important than all of the things that you want to discuss with your sister-in-law or your brother or the guy down the street that you're arguing with or the other person that you keep going back and forth and jabbing on social media. There is something bigger. When you get to heaven, nobody's showing their voter registration card at the gates. Like, that's not gonna matter. And I just feel like sometimes we think that. Do you have any idea in the relationships around you that potentially you are burning bridges and cutting off the influence of the relationship over your political view? And that's the very person that needs the life and forgiveness and hope found in Jesus. And Jesus has answered the greatest question that every single human being is asking. What do I do with my past and how do I find purpose? And we believe all of that's found in King Jesus, who was revealed on planet Earth as the Savior, King, and Messiah of the world. Don't ever burn a relational bridge for a political view. That mistake could cost somebody their eternity, and you have no idea what's at stake. That's our calling. And Paul says that's what we should do in any culture, any neighborhood, in any community. And he said, it's why I do all of this. Give myself up, become second, willing to lose arguments for the sake of the gospel. The good news of Jesus, that I might share in its blessings and that the world would know, hey, engage, be involved, have a voice, but just recognize there's something bigger at stake because nations and leaders and kings and kingdoms come and go and rise and fall. The message and the movement of Jesus will never end. And so Paul says, I do all this for the sake of the gospel. So I just want to say this to our church. And maybe this will be helpful for the many, many, many people that listen outside of our church on radio. Let's be those people. Let's be that church in this cultural moment. Let's do that in our community. Because I just want to tell you, when the church becomes preoccupied more than anything else with saving America, the church has forsaken its mission. And when the church becomes preoccupied with defending its rights more than advocating for the rights of other people, it's lost its way. And to quote one of my favorite authors, Tim Keller, he says it this way: when the church as a whole is no longer seen as speaking to questions that transcend politics, and when it's no longer united around a common faith that transcends politics, then the world sees strong evidence that maybe Nietzsche and Freud and Marx were right, that religion is really just a cover for people wanting to get their way in the world. And how many of your neighbors and friends, maybe family members, it's exactly how they view the church right now. I hear from you all the time. It's exactly how you view the church right now from the outside. And so I just want to say, yes, politics are consequential. You should be involved. You should be responsible. And there are different views represented all over our church, and Jesus is the lead story. But you should engage responsibly. But let's just not get it twisted. The fate of the Jesus movement is not at stake. And so Paul and Jesus says, I want you to resist the temptation to use, in some cases, your faith or use Jesus as a means to an end to get your way, and instead decide that you're gonna side with Paul more than anything else. Yeah, I'm gonna engage, but I'm not gonna lose sight of my chief mission. I wanna win people. I want to influence people with the message of grace and forgiveness. I want to quote we looked at last week from Paul, I want to win the respect of outsiders in the world and the community around me, because what our world needs right now more than anything else is for Jesus followers to shine a light. For Jesus followers to look and act and react and respond different from the world, as hard as it is, but you have the Spirit of God in you. You are a follower of Jesus, and we have been called to be light in our culture, to be mature, to be Christ-like, to look like Jesus, to regain our influence. And so as we close, let's be that group of people. Let's do what is just, not just what we can justify. Let's do what is responsible, not just what is permissible. Let's be the group of Jesus followers that does what is moral, not just what is modeled. And Jesus already told us the end result. If Centerpoint, if we would take this up in our community, people will see your good deeds. People nothing like you, people in your HOA, people in your neighborhood, people you do business with, the guy in 3 cubicles down you don't even like, all the people in your sphere of influence, they don't vote like you, they don't look like you, they don't have the same background, you don't see eye to eye, you've got different views, you get so angry. They will see your good deeds, and they will glorify your Father in heaven. And I'll just tell you, in this cultural moment when so many people are freaking out, just because maybe because I love history so much, I am so excited about this moment for the church when it's on mission. Study church history. The darker it gets in terms of our perception, the darker it gets, the greater the opportunity for the church on mission. The darker it gets in your neighborhood, your community, your city as you perceive it, the darker it gets, the brighter our light shines. Let's make sure we're shining our light. Jesus, I thank you so much for what you're doing in this community. I thank you, as it's gonna sound weird to say, but I'm so proud of our church. I'm so proud of what you have done and are doing here. I thank you for I don't know how many people we hear about just almost on a weekly basis who are finding refuge here, not because they agree with everything or they like the style of everything we do or they align, but because they're looking for a place where Jesus is the lead story. And the win is that we would win as many as possible, and that we would keep our focus on you. And so I thank you for the people that you are drawing to this place with that mission in mind. I pray, God, that you would move in us. I pray you would move through us, and that more than ever before, we would shine bright in this community, that we would be a contrast to the culture in how we respond, how we react, how we live, and how we love people nothing like us. And we pray all of this in Jesus' incredible name. Amen.